Welcome csc103 to a very brief introduction to using the internet. This will be our unit 7 for csc103, and we're going to talk about the internet, which really comes from the word interconnected network. And if you remember from our earlier PowerPoints, that the internet is really a WAN, a wide area network. So it's a giant network, a lot of smaller networks connected together to make the internet, but that's really what the internet is. And as far as the history, it starts back in 1969, before many of you were born, with something called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, some universities out in the West Coast, some smart people doing research, and they connected computers together. And of course, the government was involved and military was involved. Whenever there's always cool technology, it's always the government and military and things like that in the beginning. Nothing fun yet until 1991, when it was actually open for commercial use. The innovator, despite what you may have heard, is Tim Berners-Lee. This guy's still alive, and he worked at CERN in Switzerland. You'd probably, if you're into conspiracy theories, you probably heard a lot about the Hadron Collider and things like that. But anyway, he worked on the World Wide Web, coming up with HTML, and basically kind of came up with the way web pages work and the way they connect to each other. And he's still around. He's part of the World Wide Web Consortium, so he's not dead yet. He's still alive and kicking. The first browser came about in 1993. I did not work on Mosaic. I think I started out with America Online, like a lot of people. That's how they were introduced to the internet. But before that, there was Mosaic, and it was created by students. And it was the first one to display text and images, and it's actually kind of a descendant of Netscape. There was something called Netscape Navigator. And there was a big battle in the 90s between Netscape and Internet Explorer, because they said that they were hiding Netscape on Windows machines so that everybody would only use Internet Explorer. But now everything's free, so it really doesn't matter. But Netscape actually became modern-day Firefox. Now in the mid-90s, and that's when I remember first using the internet, a lot of people became familiar with everything by AOL. They used to send CDs in the mail, and then you'd put them into your computer. How you'd get started with installing the AOL software, installing a browser, and kind of getting online. You had to connect your phone cable using a modem, and it sounded something like this. And when you use that, you couldn't go on the phone at the same time. But we talked about that when it comes to networking. But that was everybody connected pretty much using dial-up at that point, with the early internet. Now, in the mid-90s, things started to expand a little bit, but there was still only 1% of the population compared to now. So 44 million users, that was a lot back then. But compared to now, and this still isn't completely up to date, but it's getting close, 57% of the world population now in 2019, this was in like fall of 2019, 57% compared to 1% back in 1995. And this just jumped from 40% in 2016. So it's climbing so much each year. So now there's 4.3 billion users from 44 million back in 1995. Now the web uses a client-server model, which means when you connect to a web server. Just like at school, when you log on to a computer, you connect to the school's server. Well, when you get on the internet, you connect to servers. When you go to websites, they're hosted on a server somewhere. So that's where you're going to view them. And if you want to host a website, you probably have to use a commercial hosting provider like GoDaddy or HostGator or something like that. There's some other free sites that you can use. Usually, if you're going to host a website, you have to host it somewhere. Some people will host their own on their own web server, but that involves a lot more security and things like that. So usually people will pay $20 a month or something like that to have somebody host their server. I have mine hosted on GoDaddy. Now, in the client-server model, you're the client. People getting on to browsers, using browsers like Chrome and Firefox and Edge, are the clients or the users. So in that client-server model, you're the client. So you're requesting page information using HTTP protocol. You'll probably see that in your URLs and your addresses. All the addresses will start with HTTP. That stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and that's the way you connect to view web pages. These are just icons of different web browsers. And obviously different companies make web browsers. Microsoft makes Internet Explorer, and they make Edge now. Apple makes Safari. Mozilla, which is an open source group, makes Firefox, and Google makes Chrome. So you're probably using one of them. There's other ones like Opera and stuff like that, but these are the most popular. And what web browsers do is they interpret HTML markup code into formatted web pages. And you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, let me show you real quick. If you go here to warren.edu, you're seeing a formatted web pages. You're seeing pictures, you're seeing colors, you're seeing buttons and rollovers and stuff like that. All kinds of things are happening. These rollovers are usually created by JavaScript. And to see what's going on behind the scenes, if I just go to the top, I'm just going to go to the top and I'm going to right click and I'll choose inspect. And this will kind of break my page in half, but this is really what's going on behind the scenes. So your browser is taking all this text that's over here, all this code. If I go over here to wrapper and then I go to header, now if I hover over header, you can see it's doing that part up there. The header's doing that. Then there's a link. Then there's an image. There's that Warren logo image. And as you go down here, it'll highlight on different things. So you'll see all the parts of the web page, but this is all HTML. There's some CSS that's going to be in here. There's eventually JavaScript, all kinds of stuff that's going to be in here. But this is, if you didn't have a browser, this is what it would look like. A browser takes all this stuff that you see on the right side here and converts it into this. And we're going to be writing some of that code, not as detailed as what you just saw there. So that's what web browsers do. Now, a couple things just to mention about IP addresses. We talked about IP addresses when we talked about networks, but every web page that you go to, whether it's warren.edu or google.com or anything else, is going to be defined by an IP address. Just like we talked about devices on your network have an IP address, all websites will have an IP address, except we don't know them by IP address, we know them by their domain name. So all these IP addresses will eventually be converted to domain names. That's what the DNS is. It's a domain name system because it's easier to remember google.com than 173.194.116.72. Just way, company names, you remember company names, not their phone number, things like that. So instead of remembering IP addresses, which is where they're actually at, we use domain names. And obviously it's very competitive to get good domain names because they're easy to remember, they come up in searches and things like that. So if you have a real hard name to spell or type in, that's a big problem for your business. Now we also mentioned HTTP protocol. That's the hypertext transfer protocol. That's the second one that's showing here. There's email protocol that you may have heard of. You may have seen these abbreviations. There's incoming POP, outgoing SMTP, IMAP. And some of these depend if your messages are going to be stored on a server or not. And you probably don't encounter this too much because most people use webmail now. So you don't see these things as much as you used to. You don't have to worry about it as much. Back when people would have to come home to their computer to get email, or they would only have email on their work computer and couldn't get it at home, some of these technologies and protocols were a big deal. But right now, since a lot of people use Gmail and they can access their work email and all kinds of email from phones and computers anywhere, that's not as much of an issue. So the email protocols aren't something that you have to know that much. HTTP protocol is basically viewing web pages. FTP is if you're uploading files to a server, where unless you're doing that, you would know that, but that's a file transfer protocol. That's for uploading things. And I'm not talking about uploading things to Google Drive and stuff like that. I'm talking about logging into a web server and actually uploading your website. You would have to do that through FTP. And also TCP/IP is basically the way your computers connect to each other. It's a transfer control protocol. It also uses IP, which is Internet Protocol. So it's TCP/IP. That's another way computers will connect, and that's the way computers are connected to each other on the Internet. I'll just talk about domain names because we were talking about warren.edu. Now this is my Warren, which is a little different. That's our LMS that we use. And a couple things on here is this thing is the protocol, and it's using an S because it's secure. Typically it's just HTTP, but it's putting an S there for security. So because you're going into an LMS where there's grades and all kinds of things like that and registration, it's a little more secure. And anything that's more secure will have an S in their protocol. And that's kind of the main domain name that you'll see for warren.edu. That's the top level domain. That could be .edu, it could be .gov, it could be .com, it could be .io, like CodePen, which we're going to use. It could be, I think Trinket uses .io. It could be .net, it could be .biz. They have different ones coming out all the time, but the most common ones obviously are, com and gov and edu and things like that. This is a subdomain. You may not always see that, but we use it for our LMS so that we know you can go there first, and it's basically a part of our warren.edu system. So it's a part of its URL, and that's a subdomain. It's not necessarily a folder inside it like ICS is, but it's a subdomain so that we can still use that as a domain that's part of warren.edu. This thing down here is really just a folder. So if you see slashes, the slash can go to a file name like something.html, or if it's just going to a word like ICS, that's a directory. They call them directories on the web, but it's really just a folder. That's all it's doing, is it's going to the first home page or the first index page inside that folder. And as far as email, people still use Outlook and things like that, and it saves to a local computer. That's even kind of outdated because most Outlook now is web-based so that you can access it from everywhere. You can access it on a phone. So not many people still use local email that actually saves emails to one computer. That's kind of an outdated thing now. Everybody's kind of mobile and able to access email from everywhere. And that's why, webmail, even just seeing it as a category of webmail, it's not even, people don't even think about it anymore because everybody can access their email from anywhere. But for a while, that was kind of a new thing, to be able to get your email from everywhere, because otherwise people would have to go home to get their home email, or they have to wait till they get to work to get their work email. But now that's not an issue. Everything's pretty much cloud hosted when it comes to email. Even this topic, Web 2.0, that was kind of a new topic. That was before Web 2.0, web pages were kind of static. If you had a web page, it would just have a picture on it. It might have links and things like that, and it may not be updated for a month or two, and it would just stay like that. But now you see web pages that are changing by the minute. News sites and things like that are constantly changing. They're getting feeds. Facebook is getting new information in it. People can add things to it and post things and all that kind of stuff. Podcasts and webcasts, all that kind of stuff. Wikis and blogs. Even those are getting a little outdated. But everything you see on social media, the Web 2.0, it meant that everything was kind of interactive. It was dynamic. It was no longer static of a web page just sitting there. No one has just a static web page. They might have it just for some information, but usually they're doing something that's more dynamic, like promoting themselves on Facebook or different platforms for that. So that's what Web 2.0 basically means. It's more of a dynamic, interactive type of web than just pictures and text the way it was in the 90s. Now, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So the L is language, hypertext markup language. Even though hypertext is one word, it's spelled out with an HT. We're going to be doing some of that, and they use these tags. They use markup tags, so it's basically text surrounded by tags. And we're going to do that in our little practice assignment with CodePen, where we're going to put H1 tags and H2 tags and paragraph tags. And they usually have an opening tag and a closing tag, and the closing tag usually has a / in it. Now, not every tag has an opening and closing tag, or not every element has an opening and closing tag, but most of them do. And usually you'll see these little / here, and they kind of indicate the beginning and end of something, whether it's a paragraph, whether it's a link, whether it's a heading, whatever it may be. And the basic structure of HTML, which we're not going to do this whole structure in CodePen when we work on things, we're not going to have to put the doc type declaration. We're not going to put that in there because we're just going to be putting in kind of our H1s and things like that. We're not going to be doing all this top stuff that I'm showing right now. We're not going to have to put our opening HTML tag. We're not going to have to put a closing HTML tag, although we could. And we probably won't use a head element either because we'll be doing things in our CSS. But in a typical web page, this is what you'll see. The head element in a web page are usually things that you don't see. The title of the page is what you would bookmark or what you see at the top of a window or top of a tab. And you might see meta tags, you might see JavaScript and CSS inside head tags, but they're not anything physically you see. Usually what you see pretty much starts with the body tag. That's the physical visual content that you'll see. That's what we're going to work on in CodePen. We're going to be putting things like, headlines and subheadlines and paragraphs and ordered lists and unordered lists and pictures and divs and things like that, and links and pictures that link and stuff like that. We'll be doing that. That's all part of the body element of a web page, which is the visual part. And again, just to break down a web page, HTML is kind of the physical content that's there, whether it's paragraphs or bullet lists or pictures or anything like that. It's pretty much the content. CSS formats everything. That's what's going to give background colors and change colors of links and do drop-down menus and stuff like that. put things in columns, everything that's going to make it look nice we're going to do with CSS. And then finally, JavaScript adds some interactivity. We can show and hide things. We could make menus kind of appear and disappear. Anything that's more interactive. We can fill out forms and have it validate the form to make sure we filled out everything. So JavaScript is more interactive. That's more like a programming language when we use JavaScript. CSS and HTML is more just kind of for the looks. So that's what we're going to be starting with first. And again, for creating web pages or HTML pages, you can use Notepad or TextEdit. There's also a lot of text editors that are free. There's VS Code, there's Atom, there's Brackets, there's Notepad++, and there's all kinds of ones that you could download for free and you could use locally on your computer. And there's things you could use on the web as well. And if you ever heard of Adobe Dreamweaver, that's something we used to use. We don't use it as much anymore, but that was used to kind of build websites as part of the Adobe suite. And there's also a lot of things you could do online. There's CMSs like WordPress and Joomla and Drupal. You might have seen commercials for Wix and Squarespace and stuff like that that are kind of more template based, and they're already hosted for you, or a lot of times they're hosted for you, and they have a lot of tools and templates that you could work with. The only problem is a lot of times your site may look like somebody else's, but you can get a lot up there without building things from scratch. So it has a lot of things already built for you, a lot of stock art and stock layouts and things like that. Some of these, like WordPress and Joomla, you could really build them out. You could do really powerful things with them. A lot of big companies will use these kind of systems to kind of build out and build online stores and things like that. Now, what we're going to do when we start some of our exercises, we're just going to do some basic HTML with some CSS and a little bit of JavaScript. We're going to be using something like CodePen, which is going to be completely cloud-based. It's going to be online so that we can do all our coding online and we could share it just like we did with Trinket when we were doing Python. So that's what we're going to be doing first. So that's just a little introduction to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and the internet.